But my family was like most Americans, basically a coffee family. But once I did get started with tea, I really, really enjoyed it. And then I got into learning about tea and tea lore. And so that's what I'd like to share today. And maybe I'll even make a few converts to whole leaf tea, because the difference is really wonderful. So, the first written record we have of tea, well, tea came first from China. I'm sure many of you know that. But way, way, way before it came to the West. Tea, we have the first written record of it coming to China in 2737 BC. That's the first written record. And it was written by, he has a name, but with that span of time, that he's the one, let's say, that gets the credit for it. And he was an emperor. People in power had power in those days, and if you didn't have some connection with the government, you didn't have much power. So he wrote a medical journal, but he talked about tea. So it's all about medicines and tea as well. So from the beginning, tea, especially in the East, has always had a spiritual as well as a medicinal component to it. We have the first record of tea cultivation not until 350 AD. And that's because prior to that time, tea was already being drunk, obviously. But prior to that time, they would cut down a tree. The farmers would cut down the tree and strip the leaves. Well, tea became gradually more and more popular until finally it dawned on them that if they kept cutting down the trees, they wouldn't have any tea to sell. So that's when, 350 AD is when tea was first cultivated. And at that time, well, if you let a tea tree grow naturally, it'll reach 30 feet. But now that it's all in plantation form, it's kept at a height of about 3 feet, which makes it really easy to harvest, because it's all harvested by hand. Both in any country that now grows tea. And of course, the government had to catch up and say, this is an opportunity to make money. So the first tax on tea came in 720. It took a while, about 200 years, but of course they finally caught up and did it. But that took much, much longer for it to get outside of China. And it wasn't until the 1600s. 1600s is a critical time for tea. And it's kind of interesting how historically things happen. Seems like more than one thing happens at a certain time. Well, the 1600s were very important in the world of tea. In 1610, the Dutch East India Company. By now there were lots of trading going on with China. And it was going then all over the world. But in 1610, that's the first time that tea was brought to the West. And in 1618, in 1618, that's when tea was introduced to Russia. Now, you know, there are certain countries that are big tea drinkers. The United States is gaining, but compared to England, which has the highest per capita tea consumption, and then Ireland, we don't consume much tea at all. But, when tea was sent to Russia, it was sent as a gift to the Tsar. And the Tsar wasn't really sure what that was. He thought it might be kind of an affront to send a bunch of leaves. So they had to send an envoy to show him how to drink tea and the value of tea. Well, getting tea from China to Russia was a tremendous undertaking. It had to go from where it was grown, and it was grown, if you can see here, it was grown down here. Then it went up to Beijing, and then by horse to the Gobi Desert, and then by camel all the way across the Gobi Desert, and then by horse again all the way to Moscow. So that took 11 months. So obviously, this tea was very expensive by then. It's only the upper class that was enjoying the benefits of tea. But they took to it in a big way, and it was called Russian caravan tea. And so I'm sure some of you have heard of Russian caravan tea. And that name still sticks with it, even though there's no longer that big caravan that takes it. But the Russians are still big tea drinkers, and because of that, they created the samovar. Apparently in Russia at that time, which would have been the 1600s, they didn't eat the noonday meal. So they became avid tea drinkers to have something, I guess, to drink from breakfast to dinner. And they could have maybe a little sugar, although tea at that stage was drunk with jam. I mean, in the tea. Very interesting. So, but in 1640, that's when tea first came to this country. Not until 1640. And it took time for it to become popular. But you've all heard of the Boston Tea Party?
Oh, yeah.
The tea came from China and India by then in chests. And the chests were 20 by 20. And I have to look it up now, I forget what it weighed. It weighed between 80 and 130 pounds.
Of tea?
Of tea.
Really count that.
Of tea.
Yeah, right?
And 342 chests were thrown overboard at the big Boston Tea Party.
Oh,
You can imagine. I mean, they weren't just throwing little boxes of tea over the side. They were hefting big things over the side of the ship. And in today's market, if you were to put a value on that tea, it would be well over $1 million. So that was quite a sacrifice for them.
Yeah.
To toss all that tea. And I can just imagine what the harbor must have looked like.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, a big cup of tea.
That's
But what I
really
have
nice.
to share with you, tea is now grown in many, many countries, and quite a few countries commercially. And if after the fashion show is over, you want to come, I have pins in all the countries that now produce tea commercially. And I'll just read them off real quick to you. India, Nepal, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, Japan, Russia, Turkey, and in Africa, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, and now in South America, Colombia. Colombia has become a big tea. Tea needs to be grown in a, and we did have somebody, did you know that? Somebody tried to grow tea here in Oregon. It has not been a commercial success. Well, there's a reason for that. Tea needs that wet season, dry season, and we've got those 4 seasons. And also, it needs a pretty high temperature and moisture, so it needs that kind of humid. So, and there are many different qualities of tea. The very best tea, no matter in what country, is grown at an elevation above 500 feet. But most tea is grown below 500 feet. 5,000 feet, sorry, 5,000. So, yeah, so that's why the very finest teas come from China. They come from this area down here, which is up against the Himalayas. And Darjeeling tea is grown at about 7,000 feet, 6,000 to 7,000. That's the very finest tea because it develops slowly, whereas the tea in the lowlands, they can pick that tea all year round. And when they pick tea, it's called a flush. So the first flush that is picked is the best quality. And the second flush is the next. Then it can go all the way down to 5 or 6 flushes. But the tea that you get, that you pay a really good price for, is all first flush and second flush. Then the rest gets used as a blend. It's as a filler. So if you see on a box that it says first flush, you know you're getting the very best quality.
Well, that's good to know.
One of the big consumers of tea that are really tea aficionados is Germany. And Germany, there was a time when Germany had a contract with India, and they got the very best tea first. But now Germany does a lot of blending, and they are very, very good at blending tea. And they have become big tea makers. They like their tea often with a little rum. So, I wanted to now show you some of the. You have to make the tea. Well, my pride and joy is my chahama. It's a Japanese tea, the latest Japanese tea. And I was very fortunate to find this. What you do is, in the bottom, they place hot coals. And the coals are tended to with brass chopsticks, and the coals are raked. So if you have a chance, come and look at these, because they're so beautifully made. So you put the coals in there, and then you fill this part with water. And when the water is hot enough, that's when the water is poured into the tea bowl. That's a traditional Japanese tea. And then the tea is that very fine sencha, the green, very fine, is put in there. And the tea master does that. So he serves the guests. You don't have big tea parties. You have little small groups of people, and it's very precise. There's always the tea scroll, and there's always a certain kind of flower, ikebana flower arrangement. And you have to acknowledge the flowers. So it's a slow process. And acknowledge the scroll before the tea is made. Then it's appropriate. Well, I have a funny short story. At one time, this Hollywood exec wanted to know what tea making was all about in town. So he arranged to get a tea party, to have an official tea service. And he went there, and I guess the tea master must have known a bit about it in advance, because he went through the whole procedure. They went through all the formalities. He filled the bowl with tea. No, he didn't fill the bowl. He admired, the guest admired the flowers, and he admired the scroll. And then the water was brought in, and the water was filled into the cup. You're not going to be a tea drinker? And then, from the master's sleeve, he pulled a Lipton's tea bag. So that brings up Thomas Lipton, who was, as you know, the first really big tea guy. He was a grocer from Glasgow, Scotland, but he had a sense for business. And when they started bringing in tea to England, he said, well, he was in the 1800s. That's the next really big tea time. He said, I know if I just serve high quality, high tea prices, I'm not going to get anywhere. I'm not going to have a market. So that's when he decided he better have tea for the common man, and that's what most of, I think all Lipton's tea comes from Sri Lanka. That has good quality tea, but he was interested in volume, and volume is not the good quality tea. And he, at that same time, you know, these clipper ships had been developed, and tea was a major force for those clipper ships. They had huge, because the first ship to bring its tea to port got its tea out and had the best chance of having high tea sales. So Thomas Lipton formed his own fleet of clipper ships that came all the way from Sri Lanka, from Ceylon, and it's still called Ceylon tea, all the way from Ceylon to England, and then from Ceylon to this country. So he became more interested, once he made it big in tea, he became more interested in clipper ships than he did in tea.
Wow.